Ahoy there, wreck hunters, and welcome back to Wreck Pirates, brought to you by Kraken Charters, a show where we dive deep in maritime history, unearthing the stories of shipwrecks scattered along the coast and beyond. I'm Captain Tom, piloting this episode today, and with me is our dive master Ben. If you want to learn more about our crew, head over to krakenchartersva.com and click the menu in the upper left-hand corner. There you can explore our scuba diving section to read about the sites we visit, the training classes we offer, and much more. To keep up to date on our episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also visit us on patreon.com for exclusive content. We're your dive buddies, above and below the surface, exploring the wrecks, stories, and skills that make up the diving world of Virginia and North Carolina. Today, we dive into an unlucky story of a freighter carrying the wrong cargo off the Virginia coast. The Consols, an English freighter carrying American cotton, caught fire while transiting through the graveyard Atlantic. Her crew fought valiantly, but her story ends in tragedy. Today, however, the Consols has been reclaimed and is an amazing wreck to dive on. Consols was a 3,500 gross ton freighter built by Bartram and Sons in Sunderland, England in 1898. Bartram and Sons itself is a historic shipyard in its own right, being founded in 1837 and building ships throughout both world wars the following century. They started off building sailing ships, transitioned to iron hulls, and then onto steel cargo ships. The Consols was one of the said steel ships, and she routinely transited from Texas around the Gulf of Mexico, up the coast and across the Atlantic, bringing cargo to England from the States. Although German U-boats did not yet patrol the waters off the North Carolina coast in 1912, like they did later in World Wars I and II, the dangers of the seas off the coast of the Outer Banks of North Carolina were enough to sink thousands of ships in the prior centuries, earning this area the nickname the Graveyard of the Atlantic.
With the Consols, the graveyard just happened to be the location, not the cause. Carrying 9,500 bales of cotton from Texas, the forward hold of the Consols caught fire in the afternoon on February 3, 1912, as the ship was off the coast of South Carolina. It was the cotton. The crew spent all afternoon and all night trying their best to contain the flames. The next day, the ship's captain, Captain Jones, alerted a nearby steamship, ironically named the Texas, of the situation. The Texas then made a wireless call for help. The call was picked up by the cutter Onondaga, which was already towing another damaged ship, the Pomona, to Newport News. A nearby British steamer, the Castle Eden, also rushed over to help. By the time the Castle Eden arrived, the fire had spread to all of the holds and was out of control. The Castle Eden attempted to tow to shallower water, but the crew were forced by the growing maelstrom to abandon the ship. All 34 officers and men made a safe transfer over to the Castle Eden. By the afternoon on this day, the Onondaga had arrived and took over the tow. However, at that point the Consols was already burned nearly to the waterline. Nearly 20 hours after the blaze began, the ship slipped under the waves and was lost.
The Consols was last reported to be 33 miles south of Cape Henry in Virginia Beach and 18 miles off Currituck Beach. A wreck we also call the 1800 Line Wreck sits in this area, just south of the VA North Carolina border, about 12 miles offshore, and we believe it to be the Consols. To my knowledge, and to what Gary Gentile has to say, nobody has positively identified the wreck as the Consols. What that means is that divers have the rare opportunity to confirm the identity of the wreck through recovering an artifact with the ship's builder's name. Before we get into diving the wreck, let's have a discussion about how the ship went down.
So, first things first on how the ship went down. This shipwreck is a little different from what we talked about in the past two episodes, which were World War II wrecks, like military casualties to some extent. This one was in 1912, before either World War, and just speaks to the tough conditions off of Carolina and Virginia. And a fire just amplified that.
It's surprising, like even in 1912, the communications that we did have, and just not very long before that, of how rescues went down was by lantern lights and people walking up and down the coast, right? Uh, I forget what they call those guys, but the original Coast Guard people would just walk up and down looking for distress signals. We talk about the conditions of Carolina and Virginia, why that wasn't the cause of the demise of this ship. It's kind of, to me, is like it has this uncanny feeling of almost like the Bermuda Triangle. There's so many ships that have fought or found their peril um, off North Carolina and Virginia, and like we said earlier, thousands of them, and it's kind of ironic. It's just like why this wasn't because of a storm, and it just happened to catch fire here. To me, I just find it like, I don't know. I don't want to say ironic, but like, just that sense of wonder, mystery. Like, is there something here in the area? Like people say is around the Bermuda Triangle where tragedy just happens to happen in that area.
Yeah, knock on wood, let's not jinx our next dive trip, but it definitely seems like there's something here with the graveyard of the Atlantic. I mean, this is 30 years before this was called Torpedo Alley, before there were U-boats, before ships were being sunk on purpose. It just was a day of bad luck. But I like that you mentioned the point about communications and how the ship signaled for help. So, being a modern captain, fishing boat captain, dive boat captain, how do you compare modern communications and what you would do in an emergency today versus what they would have done 100 years ago? Can you talk a little more about that and like what your experience shows?
Well, when we're talking about big commercial ships, I think probably one of the biggest things is like, when do you call for help? When do you call on that initial fire? Probably not. Like even on a commercial ship, small boat vessel like ours, as soon as we see smoke, fire, we're calling for help. We're alerting everyone nearby, including the Coast Guard. But on a commercial type vessel, you're going to try and contain that fire into whatever hold it's in. Now, being that it's spread from hold to hold, and they were trying to do what they could to contain it, it that probably led to a lot of the safety things that we have today. Like, you have fire doors, you have fire rated bulkheads, where there's no penetration going through those, so that if a fire happens or a flooding happens, you can seal it off and try and save the ship as a whole, but that kind of area is lost. Um, so that just comes to boat design. And as far as communications, these days we also have satellite phones, we have satellite devices where you can send and receive text messages, but there's still limited technology. But like the traditional things that ships use, which is mostly VHF radio, it's still limited to about 16 miles because it works off the curvature of the earth. And that's what 99% of the boats out there have, at least on the recreational sides. Bigger commercial ships have some other things which work off HF frequencies, which actually bounces off the Earth's atmosphere and can send signals all the way around the globe or halfway around the globe or something. It's a really long distance. Um, so when we're fishing, 60, 70 miles off the coast, honestly, we're relying on nearby ships to relay our message, to catch that message nearby and to send it on off to the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard has a lot of repeaters and can reach out pretty far, but it's you're not always going to get communication out there, so you really want to hope someone's nearby.
Yeah, so the technology is a lot more precise, it's a lot more advanced, but it sounds like some things are still the same because in this case, when the consoles were going down, it still called for help and it was still relying on other ships that were nearby.
Yep, much hasn't really changed in that. Like, the maritime community is a very close knit community as far as when there's an emergency on the water, regards to who you like or who you know or whatever. You hear a call coming over the radio, a mayday call, you're gonna respond to those, especially if you're close. Um, and it happens all the time. And most people are not saved by the Coast Guard; they are saved by a nearby boat. If you go down, the EPIRB is gonna, even if you don't get a radio communication off, you have an EPIRB, it's gonna send out a satellite signal and alert people to your location, and has a GPS tracker, and they're gonna come right to you. But that could be hours, right? You know, closest uh, Coast Guard base that we have here in Virginia Beach is actually over in Portsmouth, and there's a Coast Guard cutter in Norfolk at a Little Creek naval base. So there's some ships here, but the fastest way people can get to you is either if they're out there, or they can rally a Coast Guard helicopter, which is probably going to be coming from um, Elizabeth City. Is probably going to be the closest Coast Guard chopper, I think.
So the EPIRB is important, and I guess I'd want to ask your opinion on if either every boat should have an EPIRB and if every diver should have an EPIRB. But beyond that, it seems like also that VHF radio and being able to call for help for boats that are nearby is super important as well. So I guess, can I get your opinion on, whether every boat should have an EPIRB or whether every diver should have an EPIRB, or what kind of technology a diver should carry?
I mean, you can never really go too wrong with safety. There's really never enough. I would say every boat should have an EPIRB. Whether every diver needs an EPIRB, I don't know. I think that kind of depends on the type of diving you're doing and the conditions that are there. Because the chances of you getting kind of lost, like the movie Open Water in the States, isn't none, but it's highly unlikely. Now, what you can do, what they do make, we're in no way, shape, or form um, endorsing this product, or we're not sponsored by this product, but the Garmin InReach is a satellite communicator. It does have a distress button on it. It does alert the worldwide rescue, search and rescue network. But it does have a feature to where you can send a text message to specific phone numbers. And it, while itself is waterproof, it's not dive rated, but they do make a case for it that you can put it in, and it's not a bad product. I don't have one. I've thought of getting one recently because we were out fishing a couple weeks ago. A fisherman who was closer inshore hailed us on the radio and was to a buddy I was fishing with, was like, "Hey, so and so's wife's trying to get hold of him." And that's all the message we got. And this was relayed by two other boats to us, so it was kind of like the telephone game. And we have a fish on, like a nice fish on. And he was like, "Why is my wife getting a hold of me?" Like, it can't be good, right? She's not going to get a hold of me just because she wants to know what's for dinner or what time I'm coming home. It's not a new thing for them. So we were getting the gear up as quickly as we could and hauling tail back in to where we can get cell reception. And finally, 30, 40 minutes later, we finally got a little bit of reception. And it's like, "Oh, your job called you." And that never got passed down from boat to us to say, like, "Hey, your work has an emergency. They'd like you to come back in later or call them when you get back to shore." So kind of disheartening on our fishing, because it's like, man, we wanted to stay out there and keep catching fish because we were actually commercial fishing for bluefin tuna. And unfortunately, the fish we brought in was just undersized. So we could have stayed out there and fished longer to catch keeper if we didn't get diverted. But, we thought the worst, like what's going to happen. To add to this, there are two devices that used to be available, and I'm not sure that they still are, or it's just not widely used these days. But you used to be able to call on a VHF channel and actually make a telephone call. An operator would actually connect you through to the phone number you wanted to call. And I couldn't remember the channel. I couldn't remember who to call or what the process was. And I was like, so I haven't looked it up yet, but it's something I need to look up before we go back out to see if that's still available today. Because that would have been a game changer for us to connect that call and figure out what was actually going on. As far as diving goes, there was a product for divers that had a built-in SOS communication to that rescue network, but it also had a built-in VHF radio. And what you could also do in that is you could see a boat a couple miles away, but they're never going to see you at the water surface level unless they about run over you, and even then, they might not ever even see you. But if you could talk to them and say, "Hey, I see you. I'm over here," they could actually come rescue you before the rescue teams would ever get to you, and you have a lot higher chance of survival. But they took that off the market. They still have the GPS locator satellite response still available, but they took the VHF feature off. And in my opinion, it's also really good because if you can talk to the rescue helicopter that's coming to get you, um, that that to me is worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been a really cool feature. I guess the technology nowadays, still with the EPIRBs, even being able to send messages like that is pretty remarkable and useful. But you did say one thing which I wanted to highlight, which is that these things you can still only use at the surface, whether it's like a VHF radio or an EPIRB, even if it's something that's kind of water resistant and you can use while you're floating along, it's still only on the surface. So you can't neglect bringing like an SMB or some lift bag to be a really visible marker on the surface, or something that's going to mark your ascent before you're up if you're, for example, having to do like a longer decompression stop. So you can't neglect that side of things at all. And you kind of have to take the technology on the top side as something to add on, not something to replace, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they even have dive computers these days with built-in GPS, like, which is pretty neat because I mean, when you're diving, you're like, oh, I want to go to this wreck that I know is here. You can easily navigate your way around that wreck. Ratio Computers uh, has that available, and they're a pretty neat newer company out of Italy. Definitely recommend checking out those computers. We're not sponsored, not yet. I'd like to be.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting technology, and we're not here to do a whole technology episode, but the ratio computers, like you mentioned, do that. The Garmin buoy, the S1 buoy that they put out recently, can do like a distance map and like a diver map. So it seems like the technology is kind of going in that direction, which is interesting. But back to diving on the wreck. The wreck of the Consols lies in about 90 feet of water just south of the Virginia-North Carolina border at this 1800 line wreck location that we talked about before. The stern is intact and upside down, protruding impressively from the sand. A large propeller and propeller shaft are still easily recognizable for the aft end of the ship. Uh, Forward of that, the hull breaks down a little bit more at the engine room to expose two large boilers, one of which is standing upright, one is kind of knocked over on its side. And then forward and just a little bit after the boilers, the wreck is more broken down, and that forward section, the bow, is pretty well flattened, but you can still definitely follow the lines of the hull all the way along the sand until you get to like a pointy bow at the front. So it's, for me, I think it's a very special wreck because its stern is almost entirely intact. The engine room and the boilers still have a lot of machinery sewn, and the bow is clearly distinguishable. And on top of all of that, the stern is not just intact, but there are swim throughs in places where someone who's appropriately trained and capable and has good buoyancy can actually swim through parts of the wreck there. And you can look through narrow tunnels or under little lips of steel sheets. You can find eels or toadfish and other ambush predators. I mean, it's a magnificent wreck. I did want to kind of open up a discussion about diving on this wreck after I tell a story too about one of my favorite dives on this wreck, where we had pulled up within a couple hundred feet of the wreck, and the captain's positioning the boat to get ready to drop the anchor. And as he's doing that, the surface of the water is like glass. I mean, it was a beautiful 8 a.m. in the morning. The sun had just come up, and you could see a reflection on the surface of the water. And as we're staring out on the water in awe, we see a gigantic sea turtle head pop up, maybe 40 yards from our boat. And it looks like a loggerhead to us, real big loggerhead. We say, "Oh man, that's amazing. I hope we get to see him underwater." So we go down to the wreck, make sure that the anchor is secure and we're tied in appropriately. And me and my buddy start swimming down the aft end of the wreck to where that propeller is to where you can see that intact stern. And as we get to the aft end of the wreck, we see under one of these huge propeller blades, and the propeller blades are probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 feet in radius themselves. They're pretty big. And I look down and I see this loggerhead turtle, and it is the biggest turtle that I've ever seen in my life. And it was probably, I mean, it was definitely over half the size of one of those propeller blades. It was huge. Um, and that was just something incredible to see with that giant turtle in front of this huge propeller and stern section of the wreck, and just seeing marine life contrasted with this kind of man-made wreckage was phenomenal.
Yeah, them turtles can get pretty big. Uh, we actually were diving a wreck down in North Carolina. Similar story. We don't know if he went in there to die or he went inside the wreck and got caught up and couldn't get back out and died. Um, we were running a dive operation at the time. Last thing you want is tourists to come down and dive on the wreck and see this giant turtle um, hanging out, decomposing right there, like where we usually tie off the wreck anchor at. So we had to try to get it out of the wreck, which was a very large task. But we eventually did.
So how did you do that? Did you have multiple people go down and try and like push it out, or how did you resolve that situation?
Yeah, we actually took down two gaffs with us, and one of us got up on the top of the wreck where it was wedged because obviously it's decomposing, so it's starting to become buoyant. And one of us pushed down through a hole in the wreck, and the other like tried to hook it and pull it down out of the opening that it obviously went in there through because it was pretty large. It wasn't as big as the one you were saying, but I mean it was probably the shell on the back was probably a good 7 foot or so. But yeah, eventually it took a while, but we got it out of there, and as soon as we did, that thing shot to the surface, and it came up right next to the boat, and luckily the divers were down below, and the captain was like, "That is one of the most hard things I smelled in a while."
Yeah, I can imagine how foul that is. I mean, I've come up after a beach dive and walked back to the beach, and I've smelled just a horseshoe crab, something that's maybe 6 or 8 inches diameter decomposing on the beach, and that was probably one of the worst things I've ever smelled in my life. So I can only imagine what the turtle smelled like.
To your point on this wreck, the consoles, it is always nice when you see a ship that is mostly or partially intact and things that are very visible, where you do have a stern section, you have a propeller shaft and propeller, which is like, oh, that's a boat, right? Like to someone who comes down, versus like this is just a pile of metal and it looks like a box or a triangle or something.
Yeah, and this one has a really nice swim through too. Like it's not only the ship is intact and you see it from the outside and you can take photos of it. If you are appropriately trained, I'm going to always put that disclaimer out there. There is a pretty open swim through, which can be fun for some divers. Not to lose the point about the turtles either. I did want to bring up the fact that that turtle, I believe, was a loggerhead, but there are a couple other species of sea turtle that we see in Virginia and off the Outer Banks too, and those would be leatherbacks, which tend to be really big, hawksbill sea turtles, which have a different shape of their snout, and green sea turtles, which tend to be a little smaller than loggerheads. Um, and Tom, I'm sure you can attest to this, but I've seen, I think in the past year, I've seen all of those except for a hawksbill.
Yeah, hawksbills too are usually smaller. You usually see them like when you see the small turtles. The most common sea turtles you see around here are the loggerheads and the leatherbacks, and the most common is the loggerheads. We see them all the time in the bay. And this past summer, when we're cobia fishing, they'll come up in the bay and they'll pop up on the surface and look around and go back down under. And we keep an eye out for them and try and follow them because they usually have cobia sitting on them, and so the cobia kind of like they're just eating up the scraps as the turtles swimming along eating and stuff. So they just kind of travel with them. But I think this year we seen in one day, I think we seen like 15 sea turtles pop up on the surface around us while we're fishing one day. That's the most I think I've ever seen. That's definitely the most I've ever seen in a day. And honestly, like the summer before, I don't even think I seen that many turtles all summer.
That is something that I love about diving in Virginia Beach is that when you go out on the boat offshore, it's not just a dive trip. Usually you also get to see some sea turtles, whether on the surface or underneath, and you get to see dolphins. So it's like a sightseeing tour and a dive trip all in one.
Yeah, and I was actually talking with with Steve over the weekend. He came out fishing with me, and he was diving recently, like 2 or 3 weeks ago. They went out, and wintertime, the visibility was crazy. I mean, he showed me a video, and it was like 30, 40 feet, and the wrecks here, because wintertime and the sand tigers are making their migration, were covered in sand tigers. And then out of nowhere just comes this giant mola mola just cruising through. I mean, it's just a big one. It was really cool to see.
Yeah, we definitely need to get out there again soon, huh?
Yeah, probably sooner than later. It's just like, we all got dry suits. We should just go. We should just go pick a wreck that we haven't dove in a long time and just go dive it. Um, Even if it's a small one and just for fun for the day, even just one dive. Now that we're back in action and back on the water.
The consoles reminds you that anytime you venture into the open ocean, you have to be prepared. A large freighter on a routine trip got unlucky and faced the limitations of its time. Her story now serves as a tribute to the many forgotten ships that have fallen in the graveyard of the Atlantic. The wreck also provides a beautiful background that puts on full display the contrast between the constantly changing ideas of man and the timelessness of the ocean. That's all for this dive into the wreck of the consoles. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, leave a rating, and share Wreck Pirates with your crew.
If you got a wreck you want us to cover, drop us a line on Spotify or hit us up on Facebook or Instagram. Also, check us out on our website at krakenchartersva.com and go under the scuba diving section where there's a bunch of stuff on all the shipwrecks that we dive here, and you'll find our episodes for Wreck Pirates. Until then, where history sinks, we dive. Join us next time on Wreck Pirates.